subject. And this was first put out by California Newsreel in 2003. And although part one is somewhat dated, it's still very good. That's the portion that deals with human biological variation. And in that film, the genetics of race discussion was very much carried by Richard Lewontin and myself. Now, Stephen Jay Gould is in the film too, but he didn't really do as much as the two of us. And quite frankly, anyone who watches the film will be really clear that actually I rocked that first episode, and I was sort of carrying everybody else, but it's all good. The Encyclopedia of Race and Racism is an excellent resource. If your library doesn't have it, I really recommend that you get it. I was the editor for all of the genetics, evolution, and anthropology entries in that volume. So anyway, you will see, and you hear all the time, race is not a scientific concept. This claim has become a platitude amongst scholars in the humanities and the social sciences. However, it fails because it conflates two very different concepts: the biological race concept and the socially constructed or socially defined race concept. And so I have been quoted numerous times, New York Times, LA Times, saying Graves says there's no such thing as race. I've never said that. What I've said is that our species, anatomically modern humans, do not have biological races, okay? But the biological race concept is real. It has gone through different iterations in terms of its criteria. And one of the points that people generally do not understand is that the first biological race concepts were creationist biology, not evolutionary biology. And in fact, Terence Keele, a young scholar who's now at UCLA, wrote a book called Divine Variations, which is precisely about the development of Christian special creationist ideas that drove early race science. And in fact, it just won an award yesterday from the Iris Foundation that focuses on books dealing with religion and science. So I really strongly recommend Terence's book. And by the way, that book was very much inspired by him reading The Emperor's New Clothes. And he wanted to go deeper into ideas that I presented in the first couple of chapters. So population-based or frequency of genes really is when we start talking about evolutionary ideas about race. Now, I will also point out that since Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was a creationist and evolutionist, Lamarckians did have some racial ideas themselves, but they were not evolutionary in the sense in which we modern evolutionary biologists think descent with modification driven by natural selection. And then in the 20th century, cladistic race concepts were developed that utilize phylogenetic tools to examine whether populations could be considered unique evolutionary lineages within any given species. Now, I want to clearly differentiate the biological race concept and its various iterations from the socially constructed or socially defined race concept. Now, this concept arbitrarily utilizes aspects of morphology, geography, culture, language, religion, but this is only ever done so in the service of a social dominance hierarchy. In other words, this concept was designed for the purpose of subordinating people, for determining laws and cultural norms with regard to where people came from and what rights and privileges they would have within a society. And so these two concepts should never be confused, because it's the latter concept that we actually live in American and society and across the world today. In that sense, it's very important to understand that the socially defined race concept is both historically and cultural contextual. It changes depending upon where you're at. Race in the UK is not the same as race in the United States. It's not the same as race in the Caribbean, is not the same as race in Brazil, is not the same as race in the Far East. Okay, so it's historically, cultural, contextual. Now, today's talk really is sort of an excerpt from the article I wrote in honor of Richard Lewontin's career in the special issue on Richard Lewontin's science that was published by Science for the People earlier this year. So, variation. Few people realize that the complete title of On the Origin of Species was On the Origin of Species by the Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. So variation, as I'm sure most of you recognize, was a core component of the Darwinian syllogism. The first two chapters, Darwin writes to establish the legitimacy of it in opposition to the essentialist thinking of the natural theologians of his time. Quote, these individual differences generally affect what naturalists consider unimportant parts. But I could show by a long catalog of facts that parts which must be called important, whether viewed under a physiological or classificatory point of view, sometimes vary in the individuals of the same species. Now, I'm sure all of you know, or most of you know, that Darwin purposely did not use human examples in On the Origin of Species. Now, it's generally felt that Darwin didn't address humans because he did not want to engender a major response on the part of the clerics. Now, that's a common misconception because, quite frankly, as you probably all know, Darwin's wife, Emma, was very devout. Charles was friends with her minister. He knew a lot of clerics. He had a lot of feedback on his ideas, and there really probably wasn't going to be that major of an outcry by the clerics. And in the end, there wasn't, at least in the initial publication. But one of the reasons why he stayed away from humans, which is not well appreciated, was because he did not want to run afoul of the polygenists, such as Louis Agassiz, who were prominent scientists who felt that the so-called races of humankind were in fact different species. So Darwin, in Letters to Lyell, describes how he fears this response from the polygenists. And in fact, he points out that, that if he writes about common descent, that Agassiz would throw a boulder at him. Now, by 1871, Darwin no longer has those fears because now he's recognized as the leading person in British science, and he decides to directly take on the polygenists. And he does so in chapter 7, The Races of Man, which was published in The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And here he points out the variability of all the characteristic differences between the races before referred to likewise indicates that these differences cannot be of much importance. For had they been important, they would have long ago have been either fixed or preserved or eliminated. In this respect, man resembles those forms called by naturalists protean or polymorphic, which have remained extremely variable, owing as it seems to their variations being of an indifferent nature, and consequently to their having escaped the action of natural selection. Now, I'm sure you all recognize that Charles Darwin was a really smart person. He didn't get everything about evolution right. In particular, you all know full well that he didn't fully understand heredity. And so some of these claims that he makes in this paragraph aren't correct. In other words, there were definitely some of these traits which were strongly acted upon by natural selection and some that were not. And in a sense, Darwin is also sort of, the word I'm looking for, it's a preface to what would later be developed by Sir Ronald H. Fisher, the classical theory of natural selection. So you sort of see it running between the lines here in this passage from The Descent of Man. Get this thing to work. Okay, so now, after the neo-Darwinian synthesis of the earliest 20th century, you now have the tools necessary to really begin to understand how biological variation originates and is maintained in any species, including humans. Now, by 1942, Ashley Montagu and his students had already laid out the core problem with attempting to classify human race groups as biological races. Now, for Montagu, that core problem was the notion of discordance, which meant that when you examine the physical traits of the various groups that were defined as human biological races, those traits didn't seem to vary in a consistent or correlated way with each other. Now, the problem was further elaborated by Dobzhansky and Leslie Dunn in their work, Heredity, Race, and Society, which was published in 1946. Now, it's highly likely that Lewontin's initial theoretical exposure to the biological problem of race resulted from his training under Dobzhansky at Columbia in 1952 to 1954. Now, believe it or not, I have actually never had an opportunity to speak directly to Dick Lewontin about how and what were the impetus was for him to study this question. So I am sort of guessing. And I had an opportunity to talk to him about a lot of things, but we just never talked about this. So in the neo-Darwinian paradigm, biological races or subspecies are formed as part of the process of speciation. And one of the things that Dobzhansky makes clear in Genetics and the Origin of Species, published in 1951, was that this was a continuous process in which populations would begin to diverge in allele frequencies due to some sort of isolation, and that depending upon what happened in the history of that species, the isolation might persist, and eventually you would have the formation of what taxonomists would identify as subspecies or geographical biological races, and eventually some of those might actually go through allopatric speciation and become new species. But in many other cases, the conditions of isolation might in fact be reversed. Populations would refuse, allele frequencies would equilibrate, and biological races or subspecies would go out of existence. Now, in 1950, 1951, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization called together a panel of scholars to tackle the concept of race. Sorry, it was actually in 49, the publications came out in 50 and 51. So the 1950 statement dismissed the concept of race as altogether socially constructed. On the other hand, the 1951 committee placed more emphasis on the existence of meaningful genetic differences between human races. The second statement, entitled Statement on the Nature of Race and Race Differences, was drafted by a committee that included 5 geneticists and 7 physical anthropologists, including Julian Huxley, Gunnar Dahlberg, Leslie Dunn, J.B.S. Haldane, Ashley Montagu, and T.H. Dobzhansky. So in 1951, Dobzhansky discussed race formation. His definition of a biological race was, quote, genetically distinct allopatric populations of a species are termed geographic races, subspecies, local varieties, or simply races. Now, the problem with this definition is determining what amount of differentiation constitutes genetic distinctness. He further described races as Mendelian populations that differ in frequencies of one or more genetic variants, gene alleles, or chromosomal structures. So in his chapter on this in Genetics and the Origin of Species, he uses several examples. One of them are color patterns in the ladybird beetle Harmonia axaritis. And as you can see from the diagram here, there are a number of different color patterns in the varieties of the species. Okay, and Dobzhansky classified them in groups relative to how similar the color patterns were to each other. Now, another example that Dobzhansky relies upon was the inversion frequencies associated with altitude in the fruit fly Drosophila pseudo-obscura. So here I've plotted some frequencies associated with altitude, again from data from Dobzhansky's 1949 paper. And you can see that at low altitude, the standard inversion is at much higher frequency, but as you increase altitude, the frequency of the standard inversion goes down. The frequency of the arrowhead inversion goes up. Now, for Dobzhansky, all of these populations would be geographical races, simply because they differ in the frequencies of this gene arrangement. Now, another example he uses in that chapter is the viability, and here this means larval viability in Drosophila funebris with latitude. And in this chapter, he compares populations from various latitudes with the Berlin population that was living at a latitude of 52.31. And again, he shows that populations whose origin was at lower latitudes do better at lower latitudes, but as they go north, their viability begins to decline. So shortly after this, William C. Boyd, classic work, Genetics in the Races of Man, published in 1958, provides another definition of race. And so he says, quote, "Everybody knows what races are," he supposes. Yet people constantly use the word in different senses. Even our later discussion of the mechanisms of race formation, although it should make the general meaning of the concept clear, does not provide us with a definition. The reason for this is partially that race is a more subjective unit than is species. And classifications into races depend to a large extent upon the purpose and even the whim of the classifier. Until the differentiation of different populations has reached the stage of making them different species, it is often almost a matter of taste whether we separate them into different races or lump them together as members of the same race. Now, those of you who are familiar with the history of taxonomy and systematics, this is the old lumpers versus splitters problem. Some people tend to see uniformity, some people tend to see difference. Now, the classical theory, Dobzhansky made the point that races are not static entities, but are the result of a process. It is precisely with regards to those amorphous definitions that the work of Richard Lewontin was revolutionary. Lewontin was interested in the question of how much genetic variation should exist within a species. Now, the classic model of Fisher predicted that natural selection should eliminate lower fitness genetic variants. Therefore, if the Fisher model was true, there should be little polymorphism in nature. In contrast was the balance theory of polymorphism, which held that heterozygote superiority and other mechanisms of natural selection would retain a great deal of standing genetic variation within populations. Consequence of balance theory was that polymorphism should be abundant within natural populations. And Lewontin began studying the amount of polymorphism in natural populations since at least 1960. And this leads us forward 12 years later to the now famous paper in 1972, The Apportionment of Human Diversity. And this paper showed that the amount of genetic variation within the purported human races was much, much greater than the amount of variation between them. Now, to accomplish this, he used data on allelic variation in several human populations that had been in the past viewed as comprising biological races, specifically Caucasians, Black Africans, Mongoloids, and that was the term they used, South African Aborigines, Amerindians, Oceanians, and Australian Aborigines. So this is table 2 from that paper, which gives you a list of all of the populations whose data was used to make this calculation. So Caucasians, Black Africans, Mongoloids, South Asian Aborigines, Amerins, Oceanians, and last but not least, Australian Aborigines. So Lewontin looked at 17 loci, examined the range of variation at these, including regions for haptoglobin, 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, the ABO blood group, Rh factor, and he looked at this within and between purported races. Now, he used a standard diversity index, Shannon's H. He then calculated variation within populations, so within populations, within species, between populations, within races, so race and populations compared to the entire species, and between races, species minus race over species. Despite this limited data set, Lewontin's calculations showed that more than 84% of the genetic variation in our species occurred within populations, compared to less than 15% of the genetic variation occurring between so-called races. Now, I would argue that this was salient proof that our species did not have biological races. Remembering that Dobzhansky's argument for the existence of biological races required that there be genetic distinctness between the purported races. And certainly these data would say that that wasn't true. Now, the neo-Darwinian synthesis, which we know was a unification of natural selection with Mendelian genetics, would have predicted this. And so I'm here giving you a quote from Ernst Mayr in 1974. Mayr said, "The concepts of subspecies is fallacious." Let me do this again. The concept of subspecies is fallacious. Species are not composites of uniform subtypes or subspecies, but consist of an almost infinite number of local populations, each in turn insexual species consisting of genetically different individuals. The difficulties of the subspecies concept are intensified if one considers the subspecies not merely as a practical device of the taxonomists, but also as a unit of evolution. The better the geographical variation of the species is known, the more difficult it becomes to delimit subspecies, and the more obvious it becomes that many such delimitations are quite arbitrary. Now, shortly after that, Sewell writes Racial Differentiation in Mankind, which was one of the chapters in the 4th volume of his Evolution and the Genetics of Populations, starts out like this, quote, "There is no question, however, that populations that have long inhabited widely separated parts of the world should, in general, be considered to be of different subspecies by the usual criterion that most individuals of such populations can be allocated correctly by inspection, It does not require a trained anthropologist to classify an array of Englishmen, West Africans, and Chinese with 100% accuracy by features, skin color, and type of hair. He goes on. The occurrence of a few conspicuous differences, probably due to selection for adaptation to widely different environmental conditions, does not necessarily imply much genetic difference in general. And here he cites Ney and Roy-Cahadry, but not Lewontin, who actually found this before Ney and Roy-Cahadry did. But Ney and Roy-Cahadry have shown that the differences between Negroids, Caucasoids, and Mongoloids in protein and blood group loci are slight compared to those between individuals within any one of them. So in other words, Ney and Roy-Cahadry found the same thing that Lewontin did, more genetic variation within these purported races of humankind than between them. So Wright, on the other hand, had a means by which to examine the amount of genetic variation within species, within subpopulations. So his F statistics, for example, the population subdivision statistic, where FST is the average for multiple loci, where HT is the average of the expected heterozygosity in the total population over loci, and HS is the average expected heterozygosity over subpopulations. Now, in the chapter on racial differentiation, he computed FDT, which is Deems on the total population, which in this case was really very much the same thing for different loci, and found that for the Duffy locus, that value was 0.486. For the RH locus, it was 0.244, and so on. So in other words, some of them had high population or demic differentiation, and others did not. Now, interestingly enough, of course, the Duffy locus is an adaptation to malaria. And so Wright could have easily examined, instead of using Negroids, Caucasoids, Mongoloids, he could have utilized populations that were exposed to falciparum and other forms of malaria versus populations that weren't. And he would have also found an extremely high differentiation with regard to the Duffy locus. And so what I would argue here is that, again, we have someone coming into this question who already has made up their mind about the legitimacy of these racial classification schemes. Now, Alan Templeton utilizes Wright's FST to examine the FST that we see within our species versus that of other large-bodied mammals. And when you look at this data, we see a striking pattern. So on the left-hand side of this figure, the black bar represents humans globally. And it turns out that using, in this study, 24 medically relevant genes, Wright's FST was calculated at 0.156. Now, to the right of humans are a number of other species that have far greater population subdivision. And for example, coyotes, elephants in southern Africa, white-tailed deer in the United States, gray wolves in North America, and so on. Now, the reason, of course, why humans have so little FST, at least calculated on these loci, and these other large-bodied mammals have such high values of FST, has a lot to do with the fact that human beings have a very wide geographical range, and it's pretty much contiguous. In other words, going back to Wright's idea that you could, that anybody can separate Nigerians from Norwegians from Han Chinese, all those populations are connected by other populations. So while the probability of two individuals in Nigeria mating with individuals in Norway is probably very low, Nigerians will mate with populations to the north of them, who will mate with populations to the north of them, who will mate with populations in Sicily, who will mate with populations in the Italian peninsula until you get to Norway and across the globe. So the idea that you identify biological races by looking at geographically disparate populations, saying, oh yeah, of course, these individuals have different physical features and different allele frequencies, is vitiated by the fact that these populations, in fact, are in communication with each other. Now, some of these other species have habitats which have been broken up, and the possibility of them mating with other populations within their geographical range has been severely curtailed. Now, the main agent of this, of course, and some of you in the audience have already guessed this, is human activity. Before humans became a dominant technological species on this planet, the geographical range of many of these species was probably contiguous, and they probably mated in the same way that humans mate today. So these human-placed barriers are what are responsible for these species developing such high levels of FST. Now, genetic diversity, of course, differs by how it's measured. So if we use more modern techniques and we look at, for example, the difference between the FST encoding regions of the human genome versus the FST and non-coding regions of the human genome, we find that the FST encoding regions is far less. And that makes perfect sense, given that natural selection will act against deleterious variants that appear in coding genes, and less so, or not at all, against those that appear in non-coding regions. And so these data, and this is examination between Europeans and Africans, show that there's a huge difference between what we would expect in coding and non-coding regions. And of course, if we look at human FST by geographical distance, we find that it changes in a continuous way. So this data from Lawson-Hanley, Godot, and Belleau in 2007 showed that if we compare populations based upon how far apart they are from each other, the FSTs scale linearly with geographic distance. And that's just a complicated way of saying something very simple. Populations that live closest to each other share more genes in common, or more alleles in common, than those that are more distant from each other. But interestingly enough, if we go across the entire range of human habitation, we find that none of these populations pass Wright's threshold of 0.250, which is the minimal point at which he argued one should define geographical races or subspecies. Now, quickly, clearly, there has been geographically based genetic adaptation within our species. This figure from Fawn et al. In 2016 shows examples for which there's really strong evidence of local adaptation. And quite frankly, none of this stuff should surprise anyone in this audience. Things, for example, like adaptation to high altitude, or skin pigmentation, or lactase persistence, or anti-parasites such as trypanosome and malaria resistance. But what's really interesting is that for most of these cases for which we can demonstrate very strong differentiation, FST for these genes would be very high. Most of them are single locus traits. Only a few of them, okay, for example, polygenic adaptation to height in Northern Europe, the rainforest phenotype isn't listed here, but which occurs in rainforests in Central Africa and in the Brazilian rainforest, are examples of polygenic adaptation for which we have strong evidence. But what's most interesting is things associated with complex traits such as intelligence or personality don't make this list. Which brings up this point. James F. Crow, who I met him once, so I didn't really know him. I was a grad student in '87. He came to my talk, and he talked to me afterwards about what I was doing and how I could do it better. Said this in an interview in 2002. The question of equal opportunity versus equal outcomes becomes particularly vexing in those occupations and professions for which only a small fraction of a population can qualify. I've already mentioned the gross overrepresentation of African Americans among Olympic runners. This is closer to a true meritocracy than anything else I can think of. A stopwatch is colorblind. In this case, there seems to be no social purpose in demanding equal racial representation. In some important professions, such as physics and engineering, Asian Americans are overrepresented and African Americans underrepresented. We presumably get better research because of this. This may or may not outweigh the inequity of unequal group representation. That is a social decision. So there are a number of fallacies represented here, one of which is the overrepresentation of African Americans in Olympic running. In fact, I gave a talk on that yesterday, indicating that there's all sorts of fallacies associated with trying to attempt to claim that one socially defined racial group is better at a particular athletic event because of genes. And then, of course, the other misrepresentation is the notion that, the representation of Asian American, overrepresentation in physics and engineering is also a result of genetic predisposition for greater intelligence. On the other hand, Dick Lewontin said in The Genetic Basis of Evolutionary Change, the apparent homogeneity within races as compared to the obvious difference between them stems partly from the fact that our consciousness of racial differences is constantly being reinforced socially because racial distinctions serve economic and political ends. And with that, I will end this conversation. So I'm assuming there are going to be questions.
Nicole, will you be managing this as teacher of this class or the Q&A?
I can.
So you can do it. Sorry.
Yeah, Dr. Graves will be meeting with the class afterwards. So we have some time for the general audience if they have questions on Zoom. If you want to just turn on your mic and ask, or you can put them in the chat and I can read them.
I'm just curious. I'm going to send a question, actually not to Joe, but to people here, because I'm interested to know what people thought about that the Jim Crow stuff at the end there. I would be very interested to know where he would stand now, but certainly he always seemed relatively enlightened. Anyone ever speak to him about these issues?
Well, I mean, in that regard, and what I try to do is put, Crow in historical context, because Civil Wright, another person thought the same way. Now, I never talked to Civil Wright directly, but I had relationship with him through Michael Rose, who knew Civil Wright really well. But again, I can only go on the basis of what people wrote, and their biases seem to be really clear with regard to what they wrote. So, and of course, I have had the opportunity to speak to other folks who had ideas that didn't seem to follow the data, particularly with regard to the notion of biological variation and the classification of people into races, and which is less insidious by the way, than assuming complex behavioral attributes of these groups for which, you can't really claim genetic predisposition for. So yeah, I was honestly shocked when I saw that paper that quote coming out of Crow myself.
Yeah, I'm very surprised too. I mean, I'm not surprised that's all right, but I am much more surprised about Crow. But yeah, I don't know. I'll leave that for other people.
We have a question here in the room. I'm going to try moving the microphone over and see if it works.